I should have seen it coming. The way my father's voice turned sharp when he spoke to me. The way my mother's eyes darted away when I entered the room. The way my siblings whispered behind my back, their laughter fading the moment I got close. But somehow I still wasn't ready. Not for the moment when my father, the man who was supposed to protect me, looked me in the eye and said, "You never brought anything good to this family." The words landed like a fist to my gut. My breath hitched, and for a second I swore the ground beneath me tilted. I was standing in the middle of the living room, our family's living room, but I suddenly felt like an outsider. Like I didn't belong. My mother stood beside my father, her arms crossed tightly over her chest, lips pressed into a thin, disapproving line. My younger brother sat on the couch, arms draped lazily over the backrest, watching the scene unfold like it was some cheap drama. My older sister Stephanie scrolled on her phone, barely interested. I swallowed hard. "Dad, what are you talking about?" His face twisted as if the question itself was offensive. "I mean exactly what I said, Alyssa." He sighed like I was exhausting him. "You've never contributed anything to this family. You're a burden, a waste of time." A waste of time. I had to remind myself to breathe. Is this because I don't have a high-paying job yet? My voice was calm, but inside my heart pounded against my ribs. I had been working so damn hard. Long hours, side hustles, learning everything I could. I was building something. Something they knew nothing about. But to them it didn't matter. My mother finally spoke. "It's not just about the money, Alyssa. It's about you. You've always been difficult." Difficult. The word stung more than I expected. "Oh, you mean difficult as in not doing everything you say? Difficult as in trying to live my own life instead of being your personal servant?" My father's jaw clenched. "Watch your tone." I let out a sharp breath, my hands curling into fists at my sides. "I work hard. I'm responsible. I've never asked you for anything. And yet you still bring nothing of value," my father said. "Look at Stephanie. She has a stable career. Look at Michael. He's got his life figured out. But you? You're wasting your time chasing things that will never amount to anything." I glanced at my sister, who still hadn't looked up from her phone. She had a stable career, sure, but only because Dad pulled strings for her. And Michael? He had his life figured out because he never had to work for a single thing. Everything had been handed to him. But me? I had built everything on my own. And yet in their eyes I was nothing. My father shook his head. "We've given you every opportunity and you've thrown them away. We're done wasting time on you." I stared at him, my breath coming in slow, measured beats. "So what are you saying?" My father folded his arms. "We're saying we're done." My mother exhaled, like this was some weight off her shoulders. "You should leave, Alyssa." My heartbeat slowed. For a long second the room blurred, the voices around me fading into a dull hum. They were serious. This wasn't just anger. This wasn't an empty threat. They were disowning me. For a moment my mind flashed back to all the years I had tried to earn their approval. The late nights spent helping my mother when she was overwhelmed. The times I stayed up comforting my sister when her relationships fell apart. The money I had loaned my brother when he was reckless with his spending. None of it mattered. To them I had never mattered. I straightened my shoulders. I wasn't going to beg. "All right?" My father raised an eyebrow. "All right?" "Yeah," I said, voice steady. "I'll leave." For the first time, my sister looked up from her phone. My brother blinked like he hadn't expected me to actually go through with it. Even my mother hesitated, her fingers tightening slightly around her wrist. But I didn't give them time to take it back. I turned around, walked to the front door and placed my hand on the knob. And then I looked over my shoulder. For the first time in my life, I wasn't scared of them. "You'll regret this." My father scoffed. "Don't be dramatic." I almost laughed. They had no idea. They didn't know that the past few years I had been building something. Something of my own. They didn't know about the business I owned in secret. They thought they were cutting me off. But in reality I was cutting them off. I stepped outside, the cold air hitting my skin, and I walked away. For the first time in my life I felt free. And 2 years later they came begging. Walking away was the easy part. What came after? That was the real test. I left my parents' house that night with nothing but a single suitcase and the weight of their rejection pressing against my chest. No job lined up. No safety net. No idea what the hell I was going to do next. But I had one thing. Determination. And of course, my secret business. It wasn't much. Just an online store I had been running in the background for the past 2 years. I had started it as a side hustle, pouring whatever spare time I had into it. At first, it had been slow, barely making me anything. But over time, I figured out how to market, how to sell, how to scale. And now? It was small, but it had potential. And I was about to bet everything on it. The first few months were brutal. I crashed on my best friend Rachel's couch for weeks while I figured things out. I picked up freelance gigs, worked late into the night, barely scraped by. Some nights I would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering if my father was right. Maybe I really was a failure. Maybe I really would amount to nothing. But every time that doubt crept in, I reminded myself, I wasn't going to prove him right. So I worked, harder than I ever had before. I poured every waking moment into growing my business. I studied marketing strategies, refined my products, expanded my network. And slowly, things started changing. Sales picked up. Customers came back. The numbers grew. And then one day, just 6 months after I had walked away from my so-called family, I checked my bank account and saw something I had never seen before. A 5-figure balance. For the first time in my life, I wasn't struggling. I wasn't just surviving. I was winning. By the end of that first year, my little side hustle had turned into a real company. I moved out of Rachel's place and into my own apartment. A beautiful, modern space with floor-to-ceiling windows that overlooked the city skyline. I bought myself the things I had always wanted but could never afford. And best of all, I did it on my own. No handouts. No shortcuts. No family. But even then, even after all of that, I still felt their words in the back of my mind. You never brought anything good to this family. I wanted to forget them. I wanted to erase them from my life. But something inside me wouldn't let go. Because deep down I knew. One day they would come back. And when they did, I would be ready. I was 2 years in when the first message arrived. A simple text from an unknown number. Dad. Alyssa, we need to talk. I stared at the screen, my stomach tightening. For 2 years, I had heard nothing from them. No birthday messages. No check-ins. Not even a cold, passive-aggressive text from my mother. But now? Now they needed something. I ignored it. A week later, another message. Mom, it's important. Please call us. Please. That word almost made me laugh. Now they wanted to be polite? Still, I didn't respond. But then a phone call. And another. And finally, a voicemail. My mother's voice, shaky, almost unrecognizable. Alyssa, please, we're struggling. Your father lost his job. The house, it's in danger. We don't know what to do. I sat there, listening. My heart hammering in my chest. They were losing everything. The same people who had looked me in the eyes and told me I was worthless. The same people who had thrown me away like I was nothing. And now? They were begging me for help. I took a slow breath, tapping my fingers against the table. I should have felt guilty. I should have felt something. But all I felt was satisfaction. They thought they could tear me down. They thought I would fail. But they had no idea who they had been up against. I reached for my phone, hovering over the call button. Not yet. Let them sweat. Let them feel what it's like to be powerless. Because the next time I spoke to them, it would be on my terms. I let them wait. For 2 weeks, I ignored the messages, the missed calls, the voicemails piling up. Every day, I watched as my phone lit up with desperate attempts from the same people who once told me I wasn't worth their time. It was poetic, really. I had spent years craving their approval. Bending over backward. Trying to be enough. Trying to fit into a mold they had created for me. And now? Now they were the ones waiting on me. I had the power. And I was going to use it. Finally, after the 15th voicemail from my mother, this one on the verge of tears, I decided it was time. Time for them to hear my voice. Time for them to understand exactly who they had thrown away. I called back, and the moment my mother answered, she sucked in a sharp breath. Alyssa. Her voice was small. Weak. I leaned back in my chair, staring at the city skyline from my office window. My office. In a building I owned. Built for my success. Took you long enough? I said. She hesitated. We weren't sure you'd answer. I wasn't sure either. A heavy pause. Then she cleared her throat. Alyssa. Things have been difficult. Your father, he lost his job. I know. My voice was flat. Emotionless. A sharp inhale. Who told you? I almost laughed. It's amazing what you can learn when people start crawling back into your life. She sighed, but there was no anger in her voice. Just exhaustion. Alyssa, we need your help. Do you? I mused. Because 2 years ago you made it clear that I was nothing to this family. A burden. A waste of time. So why would you want my help now? Silence. And then a broken whisper. We were wrong. I felt those words heavy in the air between us. Wrong. For the first time in my life my mother was admitting it. But was it real? Or just desperation? She kept talking, her voice trembling as she laid it all out. Dad lost his job 6 months ago. The severance package ran out quickly. Bills started piling up. Stephanie got laid off. And Michael? Well, he never had to struggle a day in his life. So naturally he had nothing to offer. The family was crumbling. And I was their last hope. I should have felt bad. I should have felt something. But all I felt was the bitter taste of irony. Now I was valuable. Now I was worth something. I let her finish her story before I spoke. And Dad? What does he have to say? She hesitated. He wants to talk to you. I almost laughed. This was the same man who had looked me in the eye and told me I was worthless. The same man who had kicked me out of the house without a second thought. And now he wanted to talk? Interesting. I exhaled. Put him on. There was a shuffling sound, muffled voices, and then, Alyssa. My father's voice. Stern but different. Not as sharp. Not as condescending. Weaker. I let the silence drag before responding. Dad. Another pause. Then, we need your help. There it was. No sugarcoating. No false pleasantries. Just a direct plea from a man who once saw me as nothing. I gathered that. He sighed, the sound heavy with frustration. I know you're angry. Angry? I let out a short laugh. I don't think angry is the right word. But sure. Let's go with that. Another silence. Then he exhaled sharply, his voice lowering into something almost apologetic. We made mistakes. Mistakes. As if what they did was some small error in judgment. As if throwing me away like garbage was just a bad decision they regretted later. I wasn't going to let them get away with that. No, Dad. You didn't just make mistakes. You made a choice. The words hit hard. I could hear it in his breathing. The way it suddenly hitched, like he wasn't expecting me to be so blunt. You chose to push me out. You chose to cut me off. And now? You're only calling because you have no other option. More silence. Then, finally, I was wrong. A confession. A rare moment of vulnerability from the man who had spent his entire life acting like he was superior to everyone else. And yet, even now I could hear it in his tone. This wasn't regret. It was survival. They didn't miss me. They weren't sorry for what they had done. They were just desperate. And that was what made this moment so perfect. I took a slow breath, letting the power settle into my bones. Then I smiled. I'll think about it. And then I hung up. I knew they would call again. I had barely hung up when my phone buzzed with another incoming call. My father. Then my mother. Then my sister. I let them all go to voicemail. Let them sweat. For 2 years I had been nothing to them. And now they were desperate. That kind of power? It was intoxicating. But I wasn't just going to enjoy the moment. I was going to use it. Because this wasn't about money. This was about making them understand. I waited another 2 days before responding. When I finally picked up, my mother's breath hitched. Like she hadn't expected me to call back. Alyssa. She whispered, relief flooding her voice. I've been thinking. She went silent. Waiting. I'll help you. The words dropped like a bomb. You what? My mother's voice cracked. I'll help you. I repeated, cool and measured. But on my terms. She fumbled with her words. Of course. Yes, anything, Alyssa. We just need. I want a meeting. I cut in. Face to face. You, Dad, Stephanie, and Michael. No excuses. A pause. Then, okay. I didn't meet them at their house. I made them come to me. A sleek upscale restaurant downtown. One that required reservations weeks in advance. One they would never have been able to afford in their current situation. When I walked in, I saw them immediately. They were uncomfortable. My mother's hands were folded tightly on the table, her eyes darting around like she didn't belong. My father sat stiffly, his jaw tight, his pride barely holding together. Stephanie looked irritated, tapping her nails against the table. Michael was slouched in his chair, quiet for once. When I took my seat, I felt it. The shift. For the first time in my life, I wasn't the outsider. They were. I placed my phone on the table, letting the silence stretch before speaking. Let's cut to the chase. My father's jaw ticked. Alyssa, we. I held up a hand. Number you, listen. His mouth snapped shut. Power. I could get used to this. You need money. I stated it plainly. No pity, no sympathy. Just facts. My father exhaled sharply, nodding. We just need some help getting back on our feet. My mother said, her voice soft, careful. A loan. We'll pay you back, of course. I smiled. You must think I'm an idiot. My father flinched. My sister's mouth parted slightly. You want my money? I leaned forward, voice calm but firm. Then I want something in return. My father frowned. Alyssa, we're your family. You stopped being my family when you threw me out. A sharp silence. Stephanie scoffed. Are you seriously holding a grudge? It was years ago. I turned to her, leveling her with a cold stare. If you lost everything tomorrow, would you expect me to help you? She hesitated. Well, yeah. Why? She blinked. Because we're family. I smirked. Exactly. I let the words settle before leaning back. And yet, when I had nothing, you left me in the cold. Stephanie had nothing to say to that. I'll give you the money, I said finally. My mother let out a shaky breath of relief. My father's shoulders sagged slightly. But I continued, there are conditions. My father's face darkened. Alyssa, we're not here to make a deal. Then leave. I gestured toward the door. Go find someone else to beg. Silence. He didn't move. Of course he didn't. Because they had no one else. I folded my hands on the table. Here's how this works. I don't do loans. If I give you money, I own something in return. My father tensed. Own? Own what? I shrugged. Your house. My mother gasped. Alyssa, no. You need money and I need investments. So here's the deal. I'll buy the house. At a fair market price. You can stay in it. For now. But you'll pay me rent. And if you ever default. I tilted my head. You leave. Shock. They didn't expect this. They thought I would just hand over money like some naive little girl still desperate for their love. Not anymore. My father's hands clenched into fists. This is ridiculous. I smiled. Then find another option. He said nothing. Because there was no other option. My mother swallowed hard. We need time to think. I stood up, grabbing my bag. Take all the time you want. But the deal expires in 24 hours. My father's jaw tightened. My sister glared. My brother stayed quiet. Eyes fixed on the table. I took one last look at them. The same people who once discarded me like trash. Now? They were at my mercy. And I was enjoying every second of it. I walked out without looking back. I knew they wouldn't take the deal easily. Pride is a funny thing. It keeps people from asking for help when they need it the most. And in my father's case, it made him want to die on a hill rather than admit that I had the upper hand. So I wasn't surprised when 24 hours passed. And I didn't hear a word. Not a single call. Not a single message. Nothing. But I knew them. And I knew that silence wasn't surrender. It was resistance. A final attempt at holding on to the scraps of control they had left. What they didn't know. I had already planned for this. 2 days later, my mother finally called. Alyssa, we need to talk. I smirked. I figured you'd say that. She hesitated. Can we meet? No. A pause. What? We already met. I said smoothly. I gave you the deal. It's not my job to chase you for an answer. I heard the exhaustion in her sigh. Your father, she started, then stopped. What about him? I asked. He doesn't want to take the deal. I laughed. Of course he didn't. Then what does he expect? I said, amused. For me to just give him the money out of the kindness of my heart? Silence. Which told me everything. I let out a sharp breath. Wow. He really doesn't get it, does he? Alyssa, please. No. My voice was firm. Final. I don't owe him anything. If he doesn't want to take the deal, then he can figure out another way to pay his bills. She was quiet for a long moment. Then, softly. Alyssa, he's sick. I went still. Sick. The word hung between us, heavy and unexpected. What do you mean sick? My mother sighed, the exhaustion deepening in her voice. He hasn't told anyone outside of the family, but he was diagnosed last year. Heart condition. It's getting worse. I blinked. For a moment my mind raced, trying to process the information, trying to decide if it mattered. Because this was still the same man who had kicked me out. The same man who had told me I was worthless. The same man who was too proud to take my offer because it meant admitting that he needed me. Now I was supposed to feel bad for him? I exhaled slowly. And why are you telling me this now? Because maybe. She hesitated, her voice breaking slightly. Maybe you'll understand why it's so hard for him to accept help from you. I closed my eyes. There it was. The same old excuse. The same old way my mother had always justified his behavior. He's just stressed. He just wants what's best for us. You know how he is. I clenched my jaw. So let me get this straight. He's willing to lose everything. His house, his stability, his dignity. Because his ego won't let him accept my help? She hesitated. It's not that simple. No, Mom, I said, my voice sharp. It is, and it's pathetic. Her breath hitched. I wasn't going to soften it for her. Not anymore. He has 24 hours, I said finally, to take the deal. After that, I'm not interested anymore. Alyssa, no. I cut her off. If his pride is more important than his family, then that's on him. I hung up. And this time I didn't wait for a call. Back the next day I got the text. Not from my mother. Not from my father. From Stephanie. Stephanie. Dad signed the papers. I let out a slow breath south. That was it then. After fighting tooth and nail, after acting like he would rather die than admit he needed me. He finally gave in. I had won. And I should have felt triumphant. But instead I felt nothing. Not joy. Not satisfaction. Just cold, empty victory. We met one last time. This time in my lawyer's office. The house was now legally mine. The deal was in writing. My father refused to look at me as he signed the final documents. His jaw was tight, his signature rough and angry on the paper. My mother looked exhausted, her shoulders sagging in defeat. And my siblings? They were quiet. Because this was the moment they realized. I wasn't the same Alyssa they had discarded. I had outgrown them. I had surpassed them. And now I owned everything they had left. A week after the papers were signed, I got another text. From Michael. Michael, Dad isn't doing well. You should come by. I stared at the screen for a long time. Because for the first time I realized. I had everything I had ever wanted. The power. The success. The control. And yet, I wasn't sure if I had one at all. I sat in my office, staring at the text from Michael. Dad isn't doing well. You should come by. For the past 2 years I had waited for this moment. The moment when my family would need me. When they would realize I was the one they should have valued all along. And now that it had happened, I didn't feel how I thought I would. I thought I would feel satisfaction. A twisted sense of justice. Maybe even the final, ultimate victory. But instead, all I felt was tired. Because winning had come at a cost. I had spent years fighting for their approval. Then years fighting to prove I didn't need it. I had built my life from nothing. Carved out my success with my own 2 hands. And now, here I was. Holding all the power. Holding their future in my hands. And for the first time, I wasn't sure if I wanted it. I drove back to the house where I once lived. It looked different now. Smaller. Worn down. The yard was overgrown, the paint peeling at the edges. Or maybe it had always been this way. And I was just seeing it with different eyes. I knocked. The door opened slowly and my mother stood there, eyes widening in surprise. Alyssa, she whispered. I didn't say anything. Just stepped inside. The living room looked the same. The couch. The old curtains. The photos on the walls. Except now it wasn't theirs anymore. It was mine. And they all knew it. I walked past my mother without a word and into the hallway, toward my father's room. When I stepped inside, he was sitting on the edge of the bed, staring out the window. He looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Weaker. For a man who had once towered over me, whose words had cut me down like knives, he suddenly looked like nothing. Just a tired, sick man. He turned his head slightly, noticing me. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, softly, "So, you finally came." I crossed my arms. "You didn't think I would?" A dry chuckle. "Didn't think you'd waste your time." I exhaled slowly, watching him. "That's funny. 2 years ago you told me I was the one wasting time. That I had nothing to offer." His lips pressed together. He knew what I was doing. I wanted him to admit it. To say it out loud. But instead he just sighed. "I suppose you're here to gloat." I tilted my head. Would it matter if I was? His expression darkened. And for a second, just a second, I saw the old version of him. The man who had disowned me. Who had stood in this very house and told me I was nothing. But that man didn't exist anymore. Now? He was just a shell. And I realized then, I didn't need to win. Because I already had. And I was done fighting ghosts. I stepped forward, placing a piece of paper on the nightstand beside him. He glanced at it, frowning. "What's this?" "The deed to the house," I said simply. "I signed it over to Mom." His head snapped toward me, eyes widening. "What?" I shrugged. "You wanted it. It's yours. You'll just have to figure out the rest on your own." I turned, walking toward the door. "Wait." I paused. His voice was different now, not angry, not arrogant, just broken. "Why?" he asked. I didn't turn around. "Because I don't need this anymore. Alyssa." I turned slightly, my gaze meeting his. "You spent your whole life thinking power meant control, that it meant keeping people small so you could feel big." I took a slow breath. "But real power is knowing you don't have to prove anything anymore." His lips parted slightly, but no words came. I didn't wait for him to find them. I walked out of the room, out of the house, and out of their lives for good. I drove home that night, rolling down the windows, letting the cool air rush against my skin. For years I had thought revenge would fix things, that if I made them suffer it would make up for all the pain they had caused me. But the truth? They were already suffering. Not because of me, but because of who they were. Because their pride had kept them small. Because their choices had made them miserable. And I had everything I had ever wanted, a life of my own, a future that didn't include them. For the first time in years I felt light, free, because I wasn't my past. I wasn't their mistake. I wasn't their failure. I was my own victory. And that was enough.